Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Hancock, and along with my cursed-in-the-dark friend, Patrick Curran, we make up Quantitude. We're a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In today's episode, we talk about a paper that is a masterpiece, not only in terms of its quantitative contribution in helping to understand the differential role of factor scores, but also as a model of clear and concise technical communication. Along the way, we also mention Sandals and Motel 6, hotel hangers and glasses, hitchhikers under the bed, icebreakers with Roger, David Mamet films, Patrick's conversations with himself, Rondo, title colons, carving elephants, as the reader may demonstrate, tea leaves, Holzinger and Swineford, and bringing down the average IQ. We hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Do you remember a few years back when we talked about the squid spleening?
I do. Was that both of your kids or one of your kids that used that?
It was family.
The whole family. Okay.
Growing up, when we would have family dinner, and it was really important that we had family dinner every night, and that followed into my own family, and anybody could call a memory trace. Somebody would say some total non sequitur, and somebody would say, memory trace, where did that come from?
Right.
And I told an anecdote on a mediation episode about how one of my kids said, oh, it's a squid spleen. And the other kid said, yeah, exactly. And then I called for a memory trace, and it went back in this very convoluted way. I had one of those recently.
Okay.
I was at a coffee shop. Across the way was a colleague of mine who I worked with for years and is retired. And I saw her, and then that made me think of her husband, who passed away at a very sadly early age. But I really liked him. His name was Roger. He worked for a nonprofit, and he traveled extensively, something like 30 or 40 weeks out of the year, going to help these nonprofits around the country.
Wow.
And he stayed at hundreds of hotels. And he would tell them that he had one requirement for a hotel. Now, these are nonprofits. He is not staying at like Sandals resorts and stuff, right? We're talking like Motel 6 kind of thing.
I'm Tom Bodette from Motel 6, and we'll leave the light on for you.
But he had a simple request, and that was wherever you put me, I would like them to have regular size hangers and glasses in the bathroom that are actually made of glass.
Okay.
And what this was, he said, over hundreds of stays, that was a minimum baseline level of quality of the hotel. If it had these little tiny hangers that you couldn't steal, or the little thin plastic cups.
Yeah.
And he said at one point he went in and checked in, and he was a little surprised at the lower quality of the room. And he went into the bathroom, and there was somebody's glass cup from home, and there was a single full-size hanger in the closet from someone's house to meet his requirements.
That is excellent. For me, I noticed that they started blocking off the underneath of the bed, which I think probably makes it easier for them. But growing up, the first thing I would do in a hotel room, and by growing up, I mean I still try to do it, I looked to see if anybody has left anything cool under the bed, and I found so much stuff. But now they put those things there. What kind of quality hotel blocks off the underneath of the bed?
I mean, where are you going to put the hitchhiker?
Is it
right? I mean, come on.
I'm under the bed.
But the other lovely memory of Roger was he would have dinners with a new group 1 or 2 times a week of strangers. And he was this gregarious, warm and friendly guy. And he was talking to us one night about different icebreakers that he had. He had all of these little things that he would do to start a conversation among strangers. And one of my favorites is he would say, all right, I want everybody to tell me one book or one movie that you love that most people would not have ever heard of.
Ooh.
And he said he got some of his favorite movies and favorite books from these conversations. So what's one from you that you would want other people to see?
Movie's tough. I mean, like, I love Whiplash, but I think Whiplash had enough acclaim, especially since it was in Oscar territory.
Look at me.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3.
Now, was I rushing or was I dragging?
There was a movie a number of years ago called Red Belt. And it has a martial arts backdrop, but it has much more about adversity and when things are sort of going against you, having the presence of mind to think your way out of things, find a solution. And it's incredibly well acted, and it has someone I really enjoy as an actor, Chiwetel Ejiofor, and almost nobody knows that movie.
There is no situation you cannot escape. You know the escape.
So this is really funny. Because you and I are each other's doppelganger, I know Red Belt. I have seen Red Belt. It is written by David Mamet.
Yes.
Completely independently, me picking the movie I was going to share, I shit you not, is written by David Mamet. And it is called The Spanish Prisoner.
Oh.
And
yes,
this was a subtle, sophisticated con story where they're trying to fleece somebody and the Spanish prisoner is the name of the con. And I couldn't even summarize the movie if I tried. Because it is so subtle and complicated, and the relationships and the double turns.
Mr. Ross, you're in a lot of trouble.
I've done nothing wrong.
Now, Mr. Ross, if I told you this story, would you believe it?
But we independently each picked a movie by David Mamet.
That is crazy. And I remember that movie a little bit. It was a slow burn. But yes, I want to go watch it again because of you just now. That's hilarious that we both picked David Mamet.
That is really weird. So here's the pivot, though. I love Roger's premise of pick a movie or a book that you love, that you would like other people to read, but maybe is not widely known. I think we can do the same thing with scientific papers.
Absolutely. Things that we think maybe deserve a wider audience.
So we decided that in this episode, I was going to share my favorite paper with Roger sitting at the table over dinner. And on another episode, Greg will do his own.
Okay.
So in that spirit, my paper that I want to talk about today is written by Skrondal and Laake. And it is titled Regression Among Factor Scores. It appeared in Psychometrica in 2001. Now, this is a major paper, was very important, but it is not as widely read as I think it should be. It is getting long in the tooth age-wise. I mean, as we sit here and record, it's 23 years old now, and lots of amazing work has been done since then to augment what they do here. Much of it stems from things that they discussed and raised here, but I think this is a model paper in quantitative methodology. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is, but I think anyone who wants to contribute to the field should see this paper and at least see what's possible in the way that you can make a unique and meaningful and important contribution to the field of quantitative methodology. Not only is it a reflection of how we can make contributions analytically and methodologically, but also how in a very thoughtful and careful way we can provide guidance for how people can do the best work possible in applied research settings.
Yeah, you have mentioned this paper a lot, and so I'm glad that you want to focus on it. Just like when someone says what's their favorite movie, they might be saying their favorite movie because of great plot or great acting or great cinematography, right? There are a lot of dimensions. I think this paper has a lot of great dimensions to it, too, so I'm looking forward to chatting about it.
So here's what I thought we would do. I sat out on the back deck, I reread the paper probably for the 10th time, and I scribbled out the very things that you just said. Why is it that you like something? This is something I don't do enough in my own life of just ask why. I really enjoyed that book. Why? It's like, I don't know, I just enjoyed it. Why do you have to ruin it by asking me why?
You're having this conversation with yourself, to be clear.
I am having this conversation with myself on the back deck.
Mom, he's doing it again.
So I laid out a handful of bullet points of what I liked about it. And you and I can pick away at each one a little bit to talk about why that is.
Do you remember that show, Masterpiece Theater? Did you?
Only in that I would lie in bed and would hear the music as it started because my parents watched it. And the opening is Rondo.
Yeah.
And it's da-da-da, dun-dun, dun, da-da-da-da, that one. So yes, I do know that.
Yeah, right. So for those people who are under 70, Masterpiece Theater was on public broadcasting, PBS in the U.S., and they would take some particular story and really drill into it in a beautiful way. And it's exactly what you said. I would listen to my grandparents watching it. I love that memory. All right, so here we are with Masterpiece Theater. Let's go through each of your bullet points.
All right. I will share my thought, and then you can add to it as you please.
All right.
First, the title. Are you ready?
Yep.
This is going to be the Masterpiece Theater. Do it in your Masterpiece Theater voice.
Regression among factor scores.
I mean, that's it. Regression among factor scores.
Wait, let me count the number of words again.
There are
it must be a typo.
Words in the title. There is no semicolon. There is no commercial software package listed. I am as guilty of this as anybody, of writing titles that are like two independent clauses. But I just love that it is regression among factor scores, right? I think titles have completely gotten out of hand in papers.
Oh my God.
And you know I'm an avid reader, and I will take my kid to Barnes & Noble and will wander around and pick up books and thumb through them. And how many of them have a title and then a colon and it says a novel? And I just want to tear off the book covers of all of them that are in the stack. And it's like, what the hell else is it? I'm holding the book.
I saw this tweet like a week ago, and it said, a colon can completely change the meaning of a sentence. For example, Jill ate her friend's sandwich versus Jill ate her friend's colon. Sorry, that neuron fired. Yes, I absolutely love the title. It is to the point. It's not 3 frickin' lines long. And it doesn't do stuff like mention space elevators or whatever.
Easy now.
I love that paper you wrote with that in the title.
Yes, I have written a paper that has quixotic in the title. I have written a paper that has space elevators in the title. But anyway, I love the title. It is tight, focused, and unambiguously clear. Point number 2. It addresses a really important question, and it's important both analytically about how we go about the business of doing factor score estimation and using them in subsequent analyses, but also practically, because this has direct implications on the practice of empirical research and model fitting.
So the message, and I will probably take too many words to say the message, certainly far more than they did, but the message, which is a really important one, and that is we often take sets of variables and make scores out of them. Obviously, I think we probably have half a dozen episodes that lean into that a little bit here and there. But the point that they make here, which is incredibly important, is that when we're trying to look at, let's say, the predictive value of one construct on another, and for each of those constructs, we are getting scores. So a score to represent the exogenous construct and a score to represent the endogenous construct. The problem is, if we want to estimate an unbiased relation, we actually have to get scores a different way for the exogenous thing than we do for the endogenous thing. It is hugely important for people who are using scores to try to get at the structural relations of interest.
And this is terrifying on so many levels.
Oh my God,
because
yes.
We were taught that we have a set of indicators. The indicators identify a latent variable. This exists on its own. We want to establish the measurement. And then in an ideal world, we retain multiple indicator latent factors and have one factor predict another factor. But in the real world, we can't always do that for whatever reason.
That's right.
Sample size, number of items, complexity of the model, whatever it might be. As Greg says, we want to take a set of items and create some summary score to simplify the analysis and then maybe use a regression to get the relations among our predictors and our outcomes. Their opening gambit is, at least in 2001, this is a bit of a moving target time-wise, a very common way of trying to simplify the model was to get what are called factor scores that are more complicated estimates of the score than just using a sum score or a mean. And one of the things we're not going to do today is go into details of factor score estimation. But there are different ways of getting scores, and you can take the mean, you can take the sum. But what they focus on is there are two ways that literally came out of the 1930s and have not been improved upon since then. But there's called a regression method that has sometimes been associated with Thurstone, and Thurstone kept throwing up his hands and saying, I had nothing to do with this. It was Thompson, and Thompson was like, look, it's obvious the equations are just there. So it's often called just regression-based method, and then what's called a Bartlett method. And they have different criteria and different ways of calculating those, and if you're interested, you can go and read about those. But the premise that they make in opening the paper is if you use the regression score for the predictor and the regression score for the outcome, you're going to get an inconsistent estimate of your regression coefficient. If you use Bartlett as the predictor and Bartlett as the outcome, you are going to get an inconsistent estimate. And what the whole paper is they analytically prove that if you use the regression as the predictor and Bartlett as the dependent variable, then you get an unbiased, consistent estimate. Now, this is insanely hard to get your head around because what it means is the best method for getting a factor score estimate depends upon how you're going to use the score in a subsequent analysis.
Yeah, it blows your mind, right? Because you think of a factor score as being the best representation of that factor that you can get when you are limited to making it from the scores that you have in your hand. But best isn't always best, right? Or at least best depends on where it is in the model. And that's a real kick in the gut.
And one of the things I'm going to talk about is their lovely use of concise language. So they have an opening paragraph about current practices and then talk a little bit about factor scores. And then the opening line of their third paragraph says, unfortunately, the results from previous methodological research on factor score regression are ambiguous and limited.
Wow.
There you go. I mean, it's great, right? They're ambiguous and limited. And then it goes into the main contributions of this article are as follows. And then they go into a list of what they're going to do. So the main point here that I like, you don't have to go dumpster diving to try to figure out what they're interested in, why it's important. I feel like a lot of papers we write these days set up maybe a problem that doesn't necessarily need to be solved. Or if it does, it has very little implication for how we do practice. And this is just an opening 3 paragraphs, all right, not 5 pages, 3 paragraphs that set up the problem and how they're going to tackle it.
Yeah, we are very guilty of what we have called in the past saddles in search of horses. And this is not that. This is a clear problem, and it's a problem that we didn't even know we had. So that's where it's like, whoa.
So what's another dimension I like? This is analytically rigorous. They start with proofs. They have a theorem. They have corollaries. They establish what their claims are. But I got to tell you, if I can follow these analytic derivations, anybody can follow these analytic derivations. All right?
Wait, does he use sock puppets?
There are no sock puppets. But
Okay.
I could not take a sheet of paper and a pencil and do what they did here. All right, I couldn't generate these myself, but I could follow it. And they have these statements. They use probability limits. If you've seen these written, they're PLIM. And they have these statements about when does an estimate of gamma go to the population value of gamma, meaning that it's consistent. When does it not? And step by step, they go through. And not only is it analytically clear, but I love their language. So, for example, one thing I put a little check mark by is they lay out these boundary conditions where these particular values are bounded between 0 and 1, and they say that this condition holds for sensible models.
Can we say that?
Isn't that great?
Not your dumbass models, but sensible models.
And then they go through some corollaries and they say, the following 3 expressions turn out to be useful. Right? I love that. It's like there's a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
I am going to tell you my favorite line out of the entire paper, and it's embedded in these analytic derivations. Consider the following remarkable theorem. Why do I love it? It conveys this enthusiasm, this excitement, this joy. This is a remarkable theorem. And you're almost like following along as they're discovering and developing and creating, and that they themselves see this remarkable theorem. I love that line.
I do too. I like that about writing in general when the author is conveying not this false bravado or this over-the-top hyperbolic enthusiasm, but you're keeping the reader engaged and you're saying, it's okay to think this is cool right now. We think it's cool, moving it along. And I think it's also necessary in this paper because it is very equation heavy. And so every once in a while, it's a little human intervention there. I think they did a very nice job with that.
And what I like is it goes back to the old dad joke of how do you carve an elephant and it's cut off anything that doesn't look like an elephant. They cut off all the parts that don't look like an elephant.
Yeah.
And what I mean is if it doesn't serve their purpose, they don't muddy the waters by bringing in extraneous things that might be tangentially related, but are not fundamentally part of their argument. I have 2 lovely graduate students right now. They're both working on their masters. And every time they give me a draft, I put in things like, you need to expand on methods of estimation. You need to discuss model evaluation and respecification. You need to talk about normality assumptions, right? Because that's what we're training in this bigger thing. They don't talk about estimation almost at all. Yeah. They don't talk about model evaluation at all. They don't talk about a whole ton of stuff that as you're reading, you might be thinking, well, what does maximum likelihood assume about these asymptotics? What about different methods of factor score estimation? Well, what if your model doesn't fit and it's misspecified? Those are all the little parts that don't look like an elephant, and they don't raise them. And my first reading through it, I thought, oh, they need a paragraph on this. And my second reading through is, no, they don't.
Yeah. What I'm reminded of, and you went through this a couple of years ago, and I'm going through it now with my son Tate, as he's applying to different colleges. Essays used to be like 3 pages and you would submit them. Now some colleges are asking you questions where you answer in a sentence or in no more than 250 characters. Imagine that you took a paper that you really liked and I told you, cut it in half. You would swear up and down at me. You would go off and curse, but you would come back with something tighter. And then I said, now I want you to cut that in half. The act of pruning away the non-elephant and having your message being extremely clear is an art. And this really exemplifies that.
I don't know if any of my prior students are out in the world listening to this, but I know late at night you cursed me in the dark. Because one thing I make all my students do is write your dissertation in a single sentence.
Nice.
Hi, this is Sierra Bainter. I'm currently an associate professor of psychology at the University of Miami, and I'm one of Patrick's former advisees. There's actually a group of us who still meet about once a month for emotional support. Anyway, on behalf of all of us, I can indeed confirm that we cursed Patrick in the dark. During the day, too, actually.
And I think it is an elephant kind of question, which is you have to distill your entire dissertation. And I don't mean the findings and the designs and everything. I mean, write a single sentence of what you're doing. Why is this important? What is your intent? One sentence, and I know I'm being a total hypocrite in saying this, no semicolons are allowed.
Or space elevators.
Hello, my name is Patrick, and I am addicted to semicolons. Anyone who has ever written with me knows this. But anyway, so they go through, they lay out what we currently do, they go through the analytics, and they unambiguously demonstrate that if you use regression predicting regression, that you're going to get an inconsistent estimate of your regression coefficient. All right. Now, what I love is you and I would repeat all the analytics for Bartlett, because they did it all for regression.
Yeah.
They have a single sentence that says analogous results can be demonstrated for conventional factor score regression based on the Bartlett method. All right, you and I would repeat the entire thing, and all they're like is, yeah, that applies to Bartlett too.
No, what I would do is I would say something like, as the reader may demonstrate, but that is really code for, I have no freaking idea how to do it. You just make it seem simple.
All right, next point. How many papers have you read, or more likely reviewed? Because this is a very common comment I will make when I review papers. It was difficult to identify precisely what the unique contribution was being made here.
Yeah.
Right? Is that you got to go dumpster diving to figure out what is the truly novel contribution. And I am a huge fan of the author telling me what the unique contribution is and not making me go find it or guess at it or divine it from the tea leaves at the bottom of the cup.
Give me the cup. Oh, my boy. You have the grim.
And what I love is they simply move to a subheading, revised blockwise factor score regression, and it takes up half a page, and that is the core of the paper.
Yeah, so there's a beautiful transition from what we in the past have called cursing the darkness into lighting a candle, right? And a paper could absolutely have as its focus, we can't use the same scores all the time, right? That's an important message, but they don't just give us that. They say, here's the way we can solve this problem. And so the next section lights that candle, and I love it. They do a great job.
So in that spirit, they lay out their revised plan, and then they redo the analytics to show that the revised procedure that they propose actually fixes the problem that the traditional method introduces. And so they repeat those probability limits. The derivations are very straightforward. And you know what I love? Again, I'm as guilty as anyone on this. I am kind of addicted to in-sum paragraphs. So at the end of each section, and maybe I just never got out of 8th grade, which is tell them what you're going to say it, and tell them what you said. And I encourage my students to do this, is in sum, taken together before we move forward from here, is wrap it up. And I think there are situations where that is useful, but it also can bloat a paper and it can introduce a lot of repetition. At the end of their novel contribution, they say, in summary, revised blockwise FSR produced consistent estimation of all parameters in LR models. That's it. That's their in summary.
Pretty much it.
I just love the tightness and the focus of it. And you know what else I like? I don't know if you flagged this line or not, but at the end of their proof for their revised method, they say, observe that the first corollary replicates the most general analytic result on factor score regression to date obtained by Tucker 1971.
Yeah.
So they're throwing a lifeline back to seminal work 30 years earlier, where Tucker's findings slot right into their novel analytical derivations.
Yeah, it's very nice. So it comes down to something fairly simple, and that is that for factors that are exogenous in your model, the regression factor scores are what you would want. And then for factors that are endogenous in your model, then you would need Bartlett factor scores. And using that mix of factor scores will preserve the estimation of the relation that they share, that structural relation. And it's a simple message, but an incredibly important one that they lay out here.
So just remember, regression predicting regression, bad. Bartlett predicting Bartlett, bad. Regression predicting Bartlett, good.
I hear that in a sock puppet voice. I'm sorry.
Nah, those are rare, and I need to save for very specific situations.
All right.
So they finish their analytics. They show traditional methods are inconsistent. They show their revised procedure is not. And then, here's one of the things I love the most. They move to a section called finite sample performance, and they say, it is useful to complement our asymptotic results with a Monte Carlo experiment for 2 reasons. All right, so first, they're laying out that there's a purpose for a simulation, and the first reason is to look at finite sample bias, and the second is to look at standard errors. Another thing I think as a field we've become addicted to is a standard simulation. What are you simulating? What am I simulating? How are you simulating it? Without thinking about why are we using a simulation? What purpose is it serving? And they say it's useful for these two reasons. And the other thing, they only have a 2x2x2 design. They're not doing 10 different sample size. They're not doing 5 different distributions. Now, I'm not saying those aren't useful in certain applications, but they identify a very specific set of conditions that are going to evaluate the research hypotheses that they derived from their analytic theory. And it's tight and focused and serves a purpose, and I love it.
Yeah, it doesn't need to do everything. They've already derived things mathematically. The place where the math can break down is when you are not going toward infinity, but you are going toward more finite samples. And so this serves the purpose of filling the gap that the math didn't already cover for us. So I love that.
So again, we're not talking about the details of things. It's more a 30,000 foot of the paper itself. They have a single table that doesn't even take up the entire page. And they have relative bias. They have it as a function of the main effects and the interactions of the design factors. And what's really cool is they do conventional method. That's the traditional way. Their revised method. And then they compare it to full information maximum likelihood where you have multiple indicator latent factors. So that is used as like a gold standard. And they show that the results are exactly as were derived by the analytics and wrap up with just a very simple conclusion that it is behaving in finite samples in precisely the way that we would anticipate.
Yep.
And then following the simulations is kind of a standard real data application. They use a classic data file from Holzinger and Swineford back in the 1930s. Everybody and their brother uses this for various things.
If I had bought Holzinger and Swineford back in the 40s, I'd be a rich, rich person. I got a question for you, professionally speaking. How do you feel about what seems like now obligatory real data section that appears at the end of so many methodological papers?
I see it as, does it look like the elephant or not? I think there are applications where it plays a really important role in demonstrating this. I think a lot of them are just formulaic cookie cutter. Now we do a real data example. I have seen real data examples using data that comes with Levon as example data and is of questionable utility. I feel like whether you're writing a substantive paper or a methodological paper, think about the elephant. Does this look like the elephant or does this not look like the elephant? And if you don't need it, then carve it off. I didn't feel like in this particular paper, this was a significant contribution.
Agreed.
I don't dislike it, but I didn't read it and say, oh, damn, I didn't expect that. It's like, yeah, that's what you would expect.
Yeah. One of the challenges for me on those, first of all, is that it's often obligatory without necessarily serving the purpose of the elephant. The other is that we don't know truth in real data, right? And so that can create a problem when you use two different methods and you go, hey, look, they're different. I don't know which one is better, but hey, they're different. And maybe that's the point, that you get different results with different methods. But I think it really has to be a clear addition to the paper, other than the fact that a journal might have as their policy a real data example. But yeah, it didn't bother me at all, but I thought the paper was already tight without it.
And then finally, they head to the exit. They have a couple of paragraphs that just clearly and concisely summarize what they found, a couple of advantages, a couple of disadvantages. I am going to read the last paragraph, though, because I just love the ending. It's only a few lines long. And think about it from the perspective of what I mentioned earlier. They were clear and strong in their conclusions, but not hyperbolic. I find that such a hard, sweet spot to hit in my own work because we're beaten over the head of tell the reader what you found. And sometimes we tend toward exaggeration. How many individual papers have you read that call for the restructuring of how we teach children mathematics based on a sample of 180 kids? But at the same time, we are also beaten about the head of list all the limitations and all the ways that this doesn't apply. And so to hit that sweet spot, I think, is hard. And I really like this. Here is their final few sentences. The most intriguing theoretical results of this paper are undoubtedly that consistent estimators of all structural parameters in LR models can be obtained from revised blockwise factor score regression and from factor-wise factor score regression for some models if each item only measures one factor. From a practical point of view, the most important result is perhaps that conventional factor score regression performs very badly and should definitely be abandoned. That is the final sentence of the paper.
Done.
It is not hyperbolic. It is not histrionic. It is not exaggerating. That is just a strong, confident statement of what they found and what the implications are.
Yep. We all tend toward overgeneralization, and quantitative methods is no less guilty of that than any other discipline. We work for years on a particular project. We want it to be meaningful. On the other hand, we don't want to lay out, and I read this so often, right, the 94 different drawbacks and places where it might not work. So they nailed this. And how come they write better in English than I write in English?
Jeez. They write better than both of us combined. You know, it's funny. I didn't mention this earlier, but I met Anders Skrondal once.
Okay.
I have not met Laake, but I met Anders once at some conference, and somehow I ended up at a table with Anders Skrondal, Sophia Rabe Hesketh, and Andrew Pickles.
So you brought the average IQ way down, is what you're saying.
That distribution needed to be Windsorized like nobody's business. Those of you in the game know that these three people developed what is called GLAM, the generalized linear latent and mixed model approach. These are jointly three of the smartest people I ever sat with. And do you know how much I talked throughout that entire lunch? Not one damn word.
I would be too afraid.
I literally just sat there and constantly tried to have food in my mouth. So I would nod and I would point, of like, yeah, that's right. What I would have done. But all three of them were wonderful to sit with. But Anders is the sweetest, kindest guy. And that's the other thing I like, is you read a good paper from a good person, and it makes it that much more enjoyable.
Absolutely. And in sum, I know I'm not, not supposed to say that. This paper, of course, makes a really important technical contribution. But I think a great reason, and we started off with this, a great reason to talk about it is because it is a wonderful template for what good technical writing is like. It has all of the elements. So if anybody out there wants to curl up on some weekend with Skrondal and Laake, there's a lot of technical stuff here, but you don't have to read it all the way down at ground level. You can read it above just for the architecture, for the way that they explain things. And for me, I completely agree with you that it kind of hits every note for how a technical paper can be communicated well, concisely, and really just focus on the elephant, right?
Yes, it is a model for quantitative, but I think that if you are in a purely substantive area, this is a really nice piece in laying out a question, flying coast to coast in a tight, concise way. I think it's a model paper in that way.
Thanks. I really appreciate you bringing it to our attention. And I guess at some point I'm going to have to do the same, right? I better go figure out what my Spanish prisoner is.
Exactly. And if you have a date night, we recommend Red Belt or The Spanish Prisoner. Both really are great.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thanks for hanging with us. This was just kind of a fun one we were experimenting with.
And I think it was a good experiment. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they go for something that's usually more useful than those tiny hangars in cheap hotels. Usually. You can also follow us on X or Blue Sky and visit our website, quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find organized playlists and show notes and syllabi, search for past episodes, and other fun stuff. And finally, get your holiday shopping done with cool Quantitude merch, like shirts, mugs, stickers, and spiral notebooks from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized Quantitude Pod merch go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You've been listening to Quantitude, the podcast that would never curse your name in the dark. Today's episode has been sponsored by fun icebreaker games for all your crazy stat parties. Get the ball rolling with classics like, what's your favorite number? Answer must be given in natural log form only. And, if you were an R package, which would you be? And of course, who would you rather be trapped in an elevator with, Baze or Fisher? Sorry, no answers of Gandalf or Boba Fett allowed. Then turn up the heat with Never Have I Ever failed to check which GLM assumption. Find out who's been really naughty. And finally, get super spicy with Truth or Type 1 Error. Let's see who has a real alpha personality. This is most definitely not NPR.
Masterpiece Theatre is made possible by a grant from Mobile Corporation, which invites you to join with them in supporting your local public television station.